There are nights when the past feels closer than the present, when a faint disturbance in memory suggests that something once stood beside us. Something older than our stories, older than the first marks on clay. If whole civilizations can vanish without leaving a breath behind, then what else might have slipped through the seams of time, watched, remembered, and withdrawn before we learned to name the stars? Perhaps the silence in our oldest myths is not absence, but a trace. A footprint blurred by too many dawns. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is. It begins with a contradiction so small that most historians step over it without noticing. Yet it lingers like a breath caught between two heartbeats. In the earliest layers of human memory, those fragile strata carved into stone, sung in fragments, or hidden behind metaphors, there are moments when the narrative seems too practiced, too orderly, as though someone had smoothed the surface before we arrived to study it. The oldest traditions insist that knowledge was given, not discovered, that the first laws did not emerge slowly from communal life but descended, that writing was not shaped through gradual evolution, but taught in full form, and that before the first cities rose, before the first kings named their lineages, there were those who watched. The Sumerians called them the Shutuku, and sometimes the Ailu, depending on who was telling the story and what mood the gods were in that year. Later generations translated them loosely as watchers. The word feels imprecise, too modern, but perhaps it is the best approximation one can offer in a language far removed from the world that birthed it. These watchers were said to move between realms, standing at thresholds humans were not yet able to cross. The Book of Enoch, a text that survived only in scattered pieces until the 19th century, whispers of similar beings, observers sent to oversee the earliest generations of humanity, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden for 2 millennia in the Judean desert's silence, fragments of the same motif appear in seams of ancient parchment, the same outline, the same insistence that before human memory truly began, someone else was already here. Yet every attempt to examine these traditions more closely dissolves into the same haze. The earliest tablets of Sumer are incomplete, broken at their edges. The passages in Enoch leap from one narrative to another, as though someone had torn out the pages that would have anchored the story. The fragments at Qumran are full of gaps, interrupted by holes where decay has eaten through the skin of time. It is as if the ancient world tried to tell us something, but the message reached us in pieces, scattered like pottery across the floor of an unexcavated chamber. Archaeologists often remind us that absence is not evidence, and yet, in some cases, absence is the only evidence we have. Consider how the city of Eridu, believed by many scholars to be one of the world's first substantial urban centres, emerged fully formed around the 6th millennium BCE. There is no gradual build-up, no soft transition from nomadic gatherings to a structured symbolic centre. Instead, Eridu appears abruptly as a ritual hub with organised temples, administrative architecture, and an intricate social hierarchy. Even among specialists, this abruptness has long been a mystery. Did the inhabitants simply leap forward in complexity? Or were they guided by knowledge already forged elsewhere? Similar murmurs appear in Egypt's Old Kingdom, where the precision of the earliest pyramids seems strangely advanced compared to the rough attempts that follow. The pyramid texts speak not of the pharaohs learning to ascend to the heavens, but of them returning to a realm from which their ancestors came. In Göbekli Tepe, the monumental stone enclosures, so unexpectedly complex for a site dating back to the 10th millennium BCE, carry images of animals, symbols, and geometric forms that scholars still struggle to interpret. And in the oldest Vedic hymns, there are veiled references to beings who measured the world before men had names to speak of it. When patterns repeat across cultures isolated by distance and time, one wonders whether they are fragments of an older memory, not literal in detail but resonant in shape, echoes of something that once stood before us, obscured now by layers of rewriting. But perhaps the more unsettling question is not who these watchers may have been, but why so many stories insist that they withdrew. The Book of Enoch suggests they crossed a boundary they were not meant to cross, teaching too much, revealing too many secrets of the heavens and the earth. The Sumerian tradition implies that certain forms of knowledge belong to deities and not to mortals. And in many of the African oral histories collected across centuries, there is a striking theme that the first teachers left because humanity accelerated too quickly, building tools before understanding their weight. It is the same theme that appears in some Australian Aboriginal narratives, where ancestral beings are said to have instructed the first people, only to vanish beyond a veil that no human could pass through. Could these parallels be coincidence, or remnants of a deeper cultural memory from a time before the Holocene settled into its quiet rhythm? To even suggest such a possibility is to wade into waters many scholars avoid, not because the idea is inherently implausible, but because the evidence is too faint to hold firmly. Yet faintness does not always imply falsehood. In geology, subtle layers of ash buried beneath thousands of years of sediment can reveal entire histories of volcanic activity. In astronomy, the dimmest fluctuations of starlight can betray the presence of unseen planets, and in history, repeated motifs across cultures separated by oceans may hint at something older than the stories that carry them. Some researchers have attempted to trace this possibility. Anthropologist Giorgio de Santillana, in his comparative study of ancient myths, noted that the earliest cosmologies share mathematical and astronomical structures far too advanced for scattered, pre-literate societies to have independently developed at the same pace. His work was criticised, as any such attempt inevitably is, yet it raised a question that continues to hover on the edges of scholarly discussions. Why do the earliest stories know so much? Long before official histories acknowledged complex astronomy, ancient texts tracked the precession of equinoxes, the cycle that takes roughly 26,000 years to complete. Long before modern physics, they described the universe as oscillating, expanding and contracting like breath. And long before telescopes, they mapped constellations with precision so consistent that even today researchers marvel at the accuracy etched into stone. If humanity truly learned all of this on its own, then the earliest generations were astronomers, mathematicians and philosophers of astonishing skill. But if some knowledge came from those who watched, or at least those whom ancient cultures perceived as watchers, then we must reconsider the boundaries we draw between myth and memory. Still, the mind hesitates. It is easier to imagine that all of this simply arose through early genius than to consider that our past may hold layers we have not yet deciphered. Yet hesitation is not doubt. It is caution, the kind that emerges when we sense the edges of something that exceeds our understanding. Perhaps this is why the Watchers occupy such an ambiguous place in ancient memory. They are never depicted as rulers, nor as conquerors. They do not build empires or claim great cities. Instead, they hover at the periphery, present but distant, instructing but withholding, guiding but never remaining. It is the quality of someone who observes more than participates, like a guardian who cannot interfere beyond a certain threshold. Even the way they vanish in these traditions is curious. There is no grand battle, no apocalyptic departure, no cosmic rupture. They simply fade. One moment they are present, the next they are embedded only in metaphor. Their names shift, their roles distort, their images become symbolic rather than literal. And by the time the classical era arrives, the Watchers have become mythic, absorbed into the folds of religion, their original shape lost, unless, of course, that was the intention. Historians often speak of crises of knowledge, periods when old systems collapse and new paradigms replace them. But what if there were older crises, predating our written timelines, in which humanity experienced a rupture not merely of culture but of memory? A flood, perhaps, like the ones recorded in the epics of Mesopotamia, India, Greece and the Americas, or a climatic shift so sudden that entire regions became uninhabitable. Geological evidence shows that such catastrophes did occur. The abrupt end of the Younger Dryas, the meltwater pulses that drowned coastlines, the volcanic winter after the eruption of Mount Toba tens of thousands of years before recorded history. Such events could erase more than settlements. They could erase continuity. In the aftermath, survivors would cling to fragments of whatever instruction they once received, turning them into stories, symbols, rituals. The memory of teachers, guides, or beings who walked among them would become sacred, and as generations passed, those teachers would grow larger than life, transformed into deities, angels, or mythic figures whose true nature was obscured by reverence. It is not so different from how modern memory works. Even in our age of documentation, stories shift, details blur, and first-hand experiences become embellished. Multiply this process across thousands of years, through civilizations that rose and fell like cycles of breath, and it is easy to see how a real presence, if it ever existed, could dissolve into legend. But the stories remain, not loud, not insistent, but subtle, like threads woven into a tapestry whose pattern is only visible from a distance. The Watchers appear in Mesopotamia, in the Levant, in Egypt, in the early traditions of Persia, in the oral histories of Ethiopia, in the myths of Central Asia, even in the fragments of early Chinese cosmology. Always watching, always observing, always at the threshold, and then always gone. Yet one detail echoes persistently. Knowledge did not begin with humans, it was given. Modern science may resist this idea, but ancient cultures embraced it. They saw themselves not as inventors, but as inheritors, receiving wisdom from sources they could not fully explain. To them, the world was not something they created, but something they were initiated into. And this perspective, though mythological in its expression, may contain a quiet truth, that we do not always know where our oldest memories come from. Even today, when we attempt to reconstruct prehistory, we run into sudden leaps that make little sense. The jump from simple stone tools to sophisticated navigation techniques in the Pacific. The sudden rise of symbolic art across Europe and Africa around the same time. The emergence of agriculture in multiple regions almost simultaneously, despite vast geographic separation. These are not impossible developments, but they are abrupt. They suggest a world in which knowledge travelled faster and further than we assume. Who carried it? The answer need not be supernatural. It could have been groups of early humans whose civilizations were lost to rising seas. It could have been migrants who carried wisdom from unrecorded homelands swallowed by the end of the Ice Age. It could have been communities whose achievements simply did not survive the erosion of time. And yet, the stories of the Watchers persist. They wait in the background of these events, silent but present, as though guarding a memory that has not yet resurfaced. This is the unsettling beauty of ancient history, that it offers us not conclusions but invitations. Invitations to peer into the fog where myth and memory overlap, where the earliest chapters of our story blur into shadows. Invitations to wonder whether something, someone, watched humanity's first steps, guided its first questions, and then stepped back when the world changed. Maybe that is why their presence feels haunting rather than declarative. They do not impose themselves on the narrative. They simply exist at its edges, like silhouettes against the first light of dawn. And as we move deeper into this journey, one cannot help but return to the oldest question. Why did they vanish? Or perhaps the better question is, did they vanish? Or did our ability to recognize them fade? Somewhere between the fading echoes of the first stories about the Watchers and the structured histories compiled in later centuries lies a silence so persistent that it almost feels deliberate. Not an empty silence, but one shaped by what is missing, like a wall whose stones have been carefully removed, leaving only the imprint of what once stood there. It is here, in this quiet gap between what ancient cultures insisted they received and what modern scholarship can confidently reconstruct, that another contradiction begins to appear, not in the stories themselves but in the strata of time. For a long while, historians believed that human civilization moved in a straight line, from simple hunter-gatherer bands to villages, then to cities, then to states, a clean ascent. But each decade of archaeology has widened the cracks in that model. Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental stone circles built before agriculture, should not exist in a linear timeline, nor should the astronomical alignments found in megalithic structures across the world, all suggesting that early human societies carried a knowledge base far more complex than their material remains suggest. Even more unsettling are the traces of sudden leaps, moments where a culture jumps forward not gradually but abruptly, as though responding to an influence that does not leave a physical signature. It is in these leaps that the Watchers return, not as literal beings, but as an idea, a shadow, a presence that early people felt compelled to acknowledge. Whether metaphorical, symbolic, or rooted in dim memories of real encounters, the pattern is difficult to ignore. The earliest texts describe them as intermediaries between the heavens and the earth, figures who understood the architecture of the world but did not fully belong to it. The Egyptians spoke of Neteru who walked the earth before the pharaohs, beings who established order and measured the sky. The Sumerians listed kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood, under the guidance or supervision of beings whose descriptions fall somewhere between divine and mortal. And in the oldest layers of the Hebrew tradition, these watchers appear as boundary crossers, capable of perceiving things beyond human reach. Yet the traces do not stop with written texts. In oral traditions that survived the collapse of empires, similar motifs appear in places separated by oceans. In the highlands of Ethiopia, certain tribes recount stories of tall, luminous beings who taught them the movements of the stars. In Polynesia, navigators speak of ancestral figures who understood the skies so well that they could cross vast oceans long before recorded history acknowledges such voyages. In the Americas, both the Hopi and the Olmec traditions describe teacher beings who came from the place where the clouds do not move, offering knowledge of cycles, seasons, and sacred geometry. How could so many isolated cultures describe the same structure of influence? Is it simply the human tendency to mythologize wisdom? Or could there be an older layer of memory? Something half-remembered, half-invented, yet anchored in a shared ancestral experience? This is where the silence becomes suspicious. For every culture that speaks openly of watchers or teachers or primordial custodians, there are gaps in the archaeological record that mirror the narrative. Sites appear abandoned without clear cause. Knowledge emerges and then disappears abruptly. Complex symbols arise, propagate across regions, and then vanish without evolving. It is as though humanity was given glimpses, fragments, pieces of a puzzle that was never meant to be assembled fully at that time. One such puzzle lies in the abrupt emergence of writing. The earliest scripts, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Proto-Elamite script of Iran, appear in full form, not as incomplete or experimental systems. They seem to emerge already knowing what they are meant to do. The precision of early cuneiform tablets, the symbolic density of hieroglyphs, and the structure of the Indus seals all suggest a sophistication that should have taken centuries to refine. Yet when scholars search for the transition, those early tentative marks that evolve into full writing systems, they find little. The evolutionary chain is missing. The same discontinuity appears in early architecture. The first monumental works, whether at Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, or Wadi Finan, demonstrate a level of organization and symbolic coordination that implies social structures far more complex than anything the earlier archaeological layers reveal. Some archaeologists have suggested that this abruptness might be due to the incomplete nature of the record, and they may be right. Yet the pattern remains unusual. Complexity precedes the material evidence that should have led to it. For the cultures that lived through this transformation, the explanation was simple. The knowledge was given. They described themselves as recipients, not originators. Even later Greek philosophers, those whom we consider the fathers of Western thought, claimed that their knowledge was inherited from older civilizations. Plato insisted repeatedly that the Greeks were children, heirs to traditions handed down from Egyptians and other ancient peoples. Solon's encounter with Egyptian priests, recounted in Plato's Timaeus, is often dismissed as myth, but it contains a telling phrase. You know only one cycle of destruction, but many have come before. This idea of older cycles, older destructions, older restorations is woven throughout ancient texts. The Vedic tradition describes yugas, vast epochs in which knowledge rises and declines. The Maya spoke of previous creations erased by water, fire, and darkness. The Mesopotamians recorded a flood preceded by great forgetting, when the world's order was disrupted. The Greeks spoke of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each representing not technological progress, but moral and spiritual decline. If such cycles existed, then humanity's memory would be shaped not only by what it learned, but by what it survived. And survival often comes with forgetting. Consider the Younger Dryas, the abrupt climatic shift around 12 to 900 years ago. Within less than a human lifetime, temperatures plummeted, ecosystems collapsed, and entire regions became uninhabitable. Some researchers propose that this event may have been triggered by a large influx of fresh water or even an extraterrestrial impact. Whether or not the more controversial theories hold true, the geological evidence is clear. The Earth underwent a shock so sudden that it reshaped coastlines, drowned lowlands, and forced populations to migrate at a scale rarely seen in human prehistory. What knowledge would be lost in such an upheaval? What memories would survive only as symbols? If there were groups, perhaps maritime, perhaps settled along ancient shorelines now submerged, that carried specialized knowledge, their disappearance would erase the origins of much that later cultures inherited without understanding the full lineage. This may be why the earliest myths speak of teachers descending, rather than rising from among humans. Not necessarily from the sky in a literal sense, but from regions now lost to the sea. The ancient coastlines were vastly different from ours. During the last glacial maximum, up to 20 million square kilometres of land now underwater would have been dry. Those lands, now hidden beneath the waves of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, could have hosted communities whose traces are now inaccessible. This possibility, though grounded in geology rather than myth, resonates quietly with the Watcher traditions. Perhaps these beings were not supernatural at all, but survivors of older settlements, holders of knowledge preserved from eras erased by rising seas. Yet the myths describe them as liminal, as if standing between worlds, belonging neither to the human realm nor to the divine hierarchy. Could this be the voice of memory, distorted by time, describing a people culturally or technologically distinct from surrounding groups? But there is another layer, one more difficult to articulate, the sense that something about the Watchers was not merely human difference. Even cultures that preserved realistic depictions of their ancestors add an otherness to the Watchers, a quality of distance, clarity, restraint. They are always near, but never fully present. They guide, but do not rule. They observe, but do not interfere unless provoked by some boundary crossing. This motif appears in the Enochian Watchers, who intervene only when their own laws are broken. It appears in Sumerian mythology, where semi-divine beings teach early humans crafts, music, law, agriculture, and astronomy, but never stay to build cities. It appears in Zoroastrian cosmology, where silent guardians watch over creation but remain invisible to ordinary perception. Even in ancient Chinese texts, there are mentions of celestial regulators, who appear in times of natural imbalance to restore order. The consistency of this observing but withholding role is striking. If these beings were mere mythic inventions, why would so many cultures choose the same ambiguous posture for them? Mythic gods typically act, fight, love, create, destroy. But Watchers, across cultures, observe. There is something discomforting in that idea, something that challenges the modern impulse to assume that every myth must correspond to a psychological symbol or a metaphor for nature. What if the act of watching itself was central to the memory? What if the earliest humans, encountering a group whose capacity exceeded theirs, perceived those individuals not as rulers, but as observers, figures who carried knowledge but did not impose it? This would explain why the stories emphasize teaching rather than domination, guidance rather than conquest. It would also explain why their departure is depicted not as exile, but as withdrawal. They did not fall in battle or fade due to divine conflict. They simply left, as though their presence was temporary, purposeful, bound by some principle we can no longer decipher. And yet, the withdrawal is rarely simple. Many myths describe their departure as the result of transgression, human curiosity pushing too far, human ambition exceeding its boundaries, or the Watchers themselves crossing a line they were not meant to cross. In Enoch, their downfall comes from attachment, from becoming entangled in human affairs. In Sumerian tradition, conflicts among the Anunnaki lead to shifts in who remains on Earth and who returns to the heavens, a term that may refer as much to distance as to divinity. But something else lurks beneath these stories, the suggestion that humanity was not meant to know certain things too early. The boundaries between permitted and forbidden knowledge are everywhere in ancient texts. Agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, all described as gifts that must be managed carefully. Why would early cultures consistently portray knowledge as both blessing and danger, unless they believed they had learned it faster than they were prepared to? And why did they always attribute this acceleration to others? Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these traditions is the notion that the Watchers were not merely observers, but custodians of some fragile balance. one that could not withstand the unfolding of human impulses. The stories caution that their withdrawal came when humanity became too restless, too eager to shape the world without comprehending the consequences. This raises an unsettling possibility, that the Watchers did not abandon humanity, but retreated because they foresaw something inevitable in human nature, an impatience with limits, a tendency to reshape the world faster than wisdom can keep pace. If so, then the silence that followed their departure is not an erasure, but a boundary, a line drawn across the landscape of memory, marking a region we're not yet capable of entering. But the question that lingers beneath all of this is not why they left, but whether their influence left marks we have not recognized. Subtle markers in myth, in cosmology, in mathematics, in symmetries repeated across cultures separated by oceans. Patterns that seem coincidental at first glance, yet align too cleanly to ignore. Maybe the Watchers were never meant to be remembered directly. Maybe they were meant to be felt, in the sudden leaps of knowledge, in the shared patterns across civilizations, in the intuition that our story is older than our written records suggest. And if that intuition persists across centuries, across continents, across cultures, then perhaps it is not entirely an invention of the human imagination. Perhaps it is the faint imprint of something that once stood beside us, close enough to guide, distant enough to disappear without leaving a trace we could follow. There are moments in the archaeological record when the Earth seems to inhale, a long, quiet breath, and then exhale something that does not fit the pattern of human development. These moments appear like anomalies, scattered through layers of sediment and broken stone, leaving behind pieces that do not align with the trajectory we expect. Not because they are supernatural, but because they refuse to sit comfortably within the frameworks we construct. And in these anomalies, in these interruptions of linear progress, the presence of the Watchers begins to surface again. Not as figures in the sky, but as shadows cast across memory. One of the most discussed of these anomalies lies in the realm of ancient astronomy. It often surprises people how early the human species seemed to grasp the rhythms of the heavens. The alignments at Nabta Playa, deep in the Sahara, predate the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years, and yet demonstrate an understanding of celestial cycles that should have taken centuries of observation. The builders of Stonehenge arranged their megaliths with precision that required both mathematical insight and a long-term record of solstices and lunar phases. In South America, the 13 towers of Chanquillo track the annual movement of the sun with accuracy rivaling modern observational tools. And in India, the Vedic texts speak of astral cycles so long and intricate that some modern astronomers still marvel at their precision. Why does the same pattern keep emerging? Early, sudden, and precise astronomical knowledge appearing independently across the world in times when most people were still struggling with basic survival. These alignments were not accidental. They required intention, observation, discipline, and generational memory. Yet many of the societies that created these monuments left no writing, no clear technological infrastructure, no gradual build-up of symbolic systems. They left only the stones, arranged in ways that suggest their knowledge was not the result of slow accumulation but of sudden instruction. Those who lived at the time had their own explanation. They were taught, not by conquering armies or neighbouring tribes, but by figures who understood the heavens intimately, figures who watched. But teaching alone does not explain everything. It does not explain, for example, why early astronomical sites so often feel ceremonial rather than practical, oriented toward rhythms that would have mattered only to cultures deeply attuned to cosmology. Nor does it explain why so many of these sites seem to be built not at the centres of early settlements, but on liminal ground, hilltops, desert plains, secluded valleys, places where the boundary between earth and sky feels thin. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, built by hunter-gatherers who should not have been capable of coordinating such monumental architecture. Sites like Karahan Tepe, even older, whose stone pillars and carved humanoid figures suggest a symbolic world far more elaborate than anything previously known. Perhaps the builders considered these places sacred, or perhaps these were meeting grounds, places where early humans encountered the ones who watched. If such encounters occurred, they may not have been frequent. The myths often describe them as rare, sudden, unsettling. Not like constant guidance, but like brief disturbances, moments when the ordinary world opened for an instant, revealing something that did not fit within its boundaries. In the myths of the Dogon people of Mali, there is a detailed description of Sirius, a star system invisible to the naked eye. The Dogon described Sirius B, its dense companion star, long before it was confirmed by modern telescopes. They described its orbit, its weight, even its place in a larger cosmological order. Scholars have debated for decades whether this knowledge was acquired through contact with visiting anthropologists or through earlier influences, and yet the descriptions embedded in the Dogon cosmology predate any credible contact with modern astronomy. Even more curious is that the Dogon claim this knowledge was given by beings who descended from the sky, beings who watched over the earliest generations and communicated through symbolic instruction. Some see this as evidence of an ancient advanced culture, others see it as evidence of human imagination shaped by myth. But regardless of interpretation, the pattern remains. Knowledge arrives fully formed, attributed to figures remembered not as gods, not as ancestors, but as watchers. Similarly, in early Mesopotamian texts, the figure of Oannes, half fish, half man, emerges from the sea to teach humanity literacy, agriculture, and law. The Greeks later retold this story, merging it with their own mythic structure. But the earliest versions describe Oannes not as a deity but as a wise being who instructed humans during the day and returned to the waters at night. His presence is liminal, temporary, purposeful. He does not rule. He observes, teaches, and withdraws. It is this pattern of withdrawal that gives the Watcher motif its most enigmatic quality. It is not simply that these figures appear in myths. It is that they vanish as soon as their role is complete. They do not stay to build civilizations. They do not establish dynasties. They do not claim territory. They move at the threshold, open a door, and then retreat before the door closes again. Why? Perhaps the answer lies in something more uncomfortable, the possibility that their presence was never meant to remain, that their influence was always intended to be temporary, a spark rather than a torch, something offered, not imposed. Yet temporary influence leaves permanent marks. The Sumerian king list, with its rulers who reigned for absurdly long spans, thousands of years, drifts uneasily between myth and memory. Some interpret these reign lengths symbolically. Others suggest they represent dynastic lines mistaken for individuals. But there is another possibility, rarely discussed openly, that the king list preserves fragments of a memory stretched beyond human scale. Many early cultures believed that before fully human kings ruled, the world was governed by semi-divine beings whose lifespans and knowledge exceeded those of ordinary mortals. The Egyptians had their Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, said to rule before the dynastic pharaohs. The Babylonians had their antediluvian kings, the Greeks had their ages of titans, the Hindus had their earlier Manus. In every case, the pattern is the same. Long ages of rule by figures who disappear after a great upheaval, usually a flood. Flood myths lace the ancient world with uncanny consistency. They appear in Mesopotamia, in India, in China, in the Americas, in the Pacific Islands, in Africa, in Europe. Not all describe literal water. Some describe metaphorical floods, floods of fire, floods of darkness, but they all describe erasure, a wiping clean, a dissolution of memory. What if these stories are not about a single event but about a recurring phenomenon? What if the Earth truly did undergo periods of catastrophic change, events that destroyed settlements, wiped out knowledge, and forced survivors to rebuild from fragments? Modern geology supports such a possibility. Meltwater pulses at the end of the last ice age raised sea levels dramatically, drowning tens of thousands of kilometers of coastline. These rising seas could have swallowed settlements along ancient shores, settlements that left no trace but memories. Memories that became stories, stories that became myths, myths that became the foundation of traditions describing watchers, teachers, custodians who guided early humans before disappearing beneath the waves of time. But perhaps the most compelling evidence lies not in myths or monuments, but in the suddenness with which complex ideas emerged across cultures. Mathematics, for instance, appears abruptly in multiple ancient societies. The Sumerians developed a base 60 system that still influences how we measure time. The Egyptians created sophisticated surveying techniques that allowed them to construct pyramids with astonishing precision. The Indus Valley civilization used standardized weights across thousands of kilometers. Early Chinese astronomers recorded supernovae and sunspots centuries before similar observations in the West. The Olmecs engineered complex drainage systems and colossal stone heads that required intricate knowledge of stone quarrying and transport. These achievements do not suggest alien intervention or anything fantastical. They suggest interruption, a sudden shift, a moment when human societies leapt forward because something, or someone, pushed them beyond their natural trajectory. Consider the development of sacred geometry. Across cultures, similar geometric forms appear. Circles within squares, spirals, intersecting triangles, mandalas, labyrinths. These forms reflect not just artistic expression, but mathematical relationships, ratios, symmetries, harmonics. The golden ratio appears in Egyptian architecture, in Greek temples, in Indian mandalas, in Celtic stonework, in Islamic mosaics, in Mayan city grids. It is as though, independent of contact, cultures across the planet tapped into the same geometric intuition at the same moment in time. Or perhaps they remembered something shown to them before the memory of its origin dissolved. Could this be the hidden thread behind the Watcher traditions? Not literal beings with wings or impossible attributes, but individuals or groups whose knowledge was so advanced compared to surrounding societies that they seemed otherworldly. If such groups existed, they might have lived in liminal environments, coastlines, river deltas, mountain refuges, places vulnerable to collapse. Their disappearance would naturally lead to myths describing their withdrawal, and their influence would persist as fragments preserved in ritual, architecture, and cosmology. Yet there is another aspect of the Watchers that cannot be explained merely through lost civilizations, the sense of prohibition woven into their stories. In many traditions, the Watchers are described not just as teachers, but as guardians of limits. They enforce boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the knowable and the forbidden, the human and the divine. In Enoch, the Watchers fall because they cross a boundary. In Greek myth, Prometheus is punished for giving humans fire, symbolic knowledge. In many Native American traditions, trickster figures who bring knowledge also bring chaos. It is as though early cultures recognized that instruction, when given prematurely, could destabilize the balance of the world. This tension between knowledge and boundary is central to the Watcher motif. It suggests not just teaching, but restraint. Guidance offered carefully, selectively, with an awareness of consequences. And this restraint raises an unsettling possibility, that the Watchers withdrew not because they were defeated, or because humanity no longer needed them, but because humanity had begun to push beyond the capacity for guidance, that the acceleration of knowledge was becoming dangerous. Archaeological evidence supports the notion of disruption. Around 3200 BCE, many ancient societies experienced sudden upheaval. Climate change, population shifts, urbanization, all converged to create instability. Some cities flourished, others were abandoned. Writing systems emerged, warfare intensified, trade networks expanded and collapsed. Something was changing rapidly, as though humanity had entered a phase of increased complexity. In this period of upheaval, myths of guardians withdrawing, teachers ascending or divine figures departing proliferate. The Sumerian gods retreat to the heavens, the followers of Horus vanish, the Vedic devas withdraw from the earthly plane, the early Chinese immortals retreat to remote mountains. It is a global pattern, a motif of departure, of watching from afar, of letting humanity continue its path alone. Whether this departure is literal or metaphorical, the effect is the same. Humanity steps into an age where memory fragments, symbols multiply, and the clarity of earlier stories dissolves. But dissolution is not erasure, it is transformation. What remains of the Watchers are hints, echoes embedded in stories, symbols carved into stones, rituals preserved across centuries, and in fields far from mythology, subtle threads remain. In acoustics, the resonance chambers of megalithic structures suggest a knowledge of sound that surpasses simple ritual use. In agriculture, certain early plants appear domesticated too quickly, suggesting intervention rather than slow adaptation. In linguistics, The sudden spread of certain proto-languages still puzzles researchers. In genetics, the traces of ancient population bottlenecks suggest episodes of survival and rebuilding. When these threads are considered separately, they seem unrelated. When viewed together, they form a pattern, an underlying rhythm that suggests memory older than writing, older than cities, older than the civilizations we recognize. Perhaps this rhythm is what the ancients tried to articulate through the Watcher motif. Not literal beings, but ancestors of knowledge, bearers of wisdom from forgotten epochs, custodians of cycles. Or perhaps these stories do reflect encounters, brief, profound, but too fragile to survive except in myth. The ambiguity is not a flaw, it is the point. Ancient cultures rarely spoke in absolutes. They understood that some truths could only be approached through metaphor. That memory itself is symbolic, shaped by loss as much as by preservation. And so, the Watchers persist, not as figures we can define, but as spaces in the narrative where something unexplained lingers, as openings in time where knowledge surged without clear origin, as reminders that the past has layers we have not yet uncovered. As humanity moved deeper into its own story, the traces faded, but the question remained, a quiet thread winding through centuries, whispering that something stood beside us once, briefly, before slipping beyond the reach of our remembering. And if such presence shaped us, even in fleeting moments, then perhaps its echo still lives in the uncertainties we're drawn to, in the mysteries that refuse to resolve, in the intuition that our origins are wider, deeper, and more intricate than the fragments we hold. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the deepest layers of history, not the silence of absence, but the silence of something intentionally obscured. It feels like standing at the edge of a vast, unlit cavern, sensing a presence but unable to trace its outline. The more one searches, the more one realizes that the darkness is not empty at all. It is simply holding something back. And in that withholding, another contradiction emerges, more unsettling than the ones before. The earliest civilizations speak clearly of knowledge descending from elsewhere, but they also hint, quietly, almost reluctantly, at something that happened after the descent, something that altered the relationship between humanity and whatever, or whoever, once watched over it. This part of the story is not written explicitly in any text. It must be pieced together from fragments, ritual prohibitions, sudden cultural shifts, unexplained architectural decisions, hints of tension buried under layers of myth. It is here that the narrative of the Watchers deepens into something far more complex than simple guardians or teachers. For if they came once, then something must have happened to create the boundary that would later be remembered as their withdrawal. And that boundary is visible most clearly not in myths of descent, but in myths of restriction. All around the ancient world, beginning around the same broad period, roughly between 5000 and 3000 BCE, there is an unmistakable change. Societies begin erecting monumental structures not to call down the Watchers, but to keep something at bay. Temples shift from open-air shrines to enclosed sanctuaries. Ritual spaces become increasingly controlled, increasingly hierarchical, increasingly guarded. Masks, once symbols of transformation, become symbols of protection. Incense is burned not only for the gods but to purify the threshold, a phrase found in multiple early texts from Mesopotamia, Egypt and the Levant. Something about the relationship between humans and the unseen world had changed. The earliest Sumerian records refer to those who descended before with reverence, but by the time of the Old Babylonian period the tone grows darker. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods complain not of humanity's ignorance, but of its noise. The term they use, Rigmi, refers not simply to physical sound, but to disturbance, disruption, imbalance. Humanity becomes too numerous, too restless, too unpredictable. The gods withdraw. The memory of Watchers becomes a warning. The Egyptian texts echo this transformation. The earliest traditions, those preserved in the pyramid text, describe beings who walked alongside humanity, teaching them the ways of heaven. But later periods speak of hidden ones, Amun, whose name itself means the concealed. The early gods are close. The later gods retreat into the invisible realm. Even the architecture reflects this shift. The earliest temples are open courtyards under the sky, but as time passes they become labyrinths of chambers, dim corridors, sanctuaries hidden deep within stone. The sacred moves inward, away from the visible world, as though retreating from some forgotten fracture. In the Indus Valley, there is a sudden emergence of seals depicting ascetic figures surrounded by animals and thresholds, gates that are not gates, doors that open into symbolic rather than physical realms. The imagery suggests that knowledge once shared freely now requires mediation. Access must be controlled. In China, early shamanic traditions speak of the Wu, individuals capable of traversing the boundary between worlds. But by the time of the Zhou dynasty, such practices are restricted, regulated, and in some cases forbidden. Access to the unseen becomes a matter of state, not communal memory. The pattern repeats in Mesoamerica. The earliest Olmec sites show figures in positions of communication, often between earth and sky, often surrounded by symbols of sight, vision, perception. But a few centuries later, similar symbols are carved in contexts of warning: serpents guarding thresholds, jaguars protecting sanctuaries, masks used not to reveal, but to hide. What happened? The simplest explanation is that societies evolved and became more complex. But simplicity rarely explains global patterns of simultaneous symbolic change. Something deeper must have occurred to prompt cultures across continents to shift their cosmologies, rituals, and architectural principles in the same direction: inward, guarded, concealed. One possible clue lies in a peculiar category of ancient artifacts, those that are deliberately broken. Across the Near East, archaeologists have found ritual objects that were intentionally shattered before being buried: figurines, masks, bowls, stone plaques. The breakage is deliberate, systematic, symbolic. A separation, a severing. Some scholars believe these items were broken to release spirits or to retire symbols. But other interpretations suggest something more charged: the breaking of a connection, the closing of a door. In the oldest strata of Çatalhöyük, one finds bull skulls embedded into walls, symbols of power, of guardianship, of thresholds. But in later layers, the skulls are removed, the symbolism muted, as if the original function of these guardians is no longer needed, or no longer permitted. Something shifted decisively between the world that remembered watchers and the world that no longer welcomed them. This shift is also visible in language. In early texts, the vocabulary surrounding watchers emphasizes presence: those who see, those who know, those who stand at the boundary. But in later texts, the vocabulary shifts toward absence: those who must not be summoned, those who are hidden, those whose names are forbidden. In some traditions, the watchers become demons. In others, angels forbidden to descend. In others still, they become ancestors whose contact with the living is limited to ritual dream states. The transformation is too consistent to be coincidence. Something caused humanity to redefine the boundary between itself and the watchers. Many researchers, particularly in comparative mythology, have suggested that this shift corresponds to a psychological transition: the rise of hierarchical societies, the codification of religion, the need to centralize symbolic power. But while these factors undoubtedly played a role, they do not explain the earliest layer of the pattern, the one that predates dynastic states. Before writing, before kingship, before monumental architecture, something occurred that made communities shrink from direct encounter with whatever they had once welcomed. This shift can be traced indirectly through the emergence of taboo. Taboo is one of the earliest forms of cultural regulation. It appears in seemingly unrelated societies: Polynesian islands, Siberian tribes, African pastoralists, early Mesopotamian settlements. The patterns are strikingly similar. Certain mountains become forbidden, certain caves become restricted, certain rituals are no longer performed, certain symbols are hidden, and in almost every case the taboo is attached to a memory that has become dangerous to approach. The Polynesian concept of tapu originally referred not to prohibition but to sacredness, something powerful but dangerous. The earliest Mesopotamian Kudurra stones list forbidden boundaries with accompanying curses for those who cross them. In the Hebrew tradition, the mountain where divine presence descends becomes restricted to all but the few. In early China, sacred mountains are considered sites of peril as much as spiritual access. In Africa, ancient rock shelters depict beings interacting with shamans, but later generations avoid these shelters, claiming they are places of risk, not knowledge. Why would humanity move from welcoming presence to fearing it? One answer appears quietly in the oldest flood myths, not the dramatic global cataclysms, but the more subtle ones that speak of corrupted boundaries. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers cross a line not meant to be crossed, teaching forbidden knowledge. In Mesopotamian lore, the mixing of divine and mortal realms leads to chaos. In Greek myth, the Titans interfere too directly in the mortal world, prompting Zeus to establish new laws. In early Central Asian stories, sky beings begin to interact too closely with humans, leading to upheaval. In the Vedic tradition, certain beings descend without permission, leading to cosmic imbalance. In each case, the narrative describes a rupture, an event in which the Watchers, or those like them, participated in something that destabilized the order of the world. Whether this rupture was literal or metaphorical does not matter for the arc of memory. What matters is that afterward, the relationship changed. Some scholars interpret this as a symbolic expression of ecological trauma. Floods, climate shifts, migrations, disasters. Others interpret it as a metaphor for cultural shifts, the rise of patriarchy, the consolidation of priesthoods, the need to regulate ecstatic or shamanic practices. But these interpretations fail to explain why the narratives consistently attribute the rupture not to human actions alone, but to interactions between humans and Watchers. Something about the contact became dangerous. Perhaps the contact revealed knowledge too powerful for early societies to wield responsibly. Metallurgy, for instance, emerges abruptly in multiple regions, often accompanied by myths of divine or semi-divine instruction. The forging of metal becomes associated with both creation and destruction. In many traditions, the first smiths are depicted as liminal beings, neither fully human nor fully other. The knowledge of fire, of transformation, of shaping the world, once symbolic, now literal, becomes a threshold that must be regulated. Or consider the sudden appearance of writing. The earlier scribes were viewed with distrust. In some cultures, writing was considered dangerous, a privilege reserved for the few. In Egypt, the myth of Thoth warns of knowledge that can uplift or destroy. In Mesopotamia, scribal knowledge becomes a form of sacred power. In Mesoamerica, glyphs are associated with gods of both creation and death. Knowledge itself became taboo. The Watchers, as bearers of knowledge, would naturally become figures of ambivalence, revered, feared, remembered, but kept at a distance. Another clue lies in the sudden standardization of cosmological order. Early cosmologies are open, fluid, symbolic. But after a certain point, around the rise of early states, they become rigid, structured, hierarchical. The cosmos becomes something controlled, not collaboratively observed. Access to the sacred becomes mediated by priests, kings, intermediaries. The free movement between realms described in older myths becomes restricted. Why restrict access unless something once crossed too freely? This is where the archaeological record begins to reflect the story hinted at in myth. Around the time these shifts occur, there is an explosion of boundary architecture: walls, enclosures, city gates, ritual thresholds. Not all of these serve defensive or practical functions. Many appear symbolic, oriented toward controlling unseen forces. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the platform mounds of the Americas, the earthen enclosures of Neolithic Europe, all position themselves as intermediaries between worlds, but are structured to maintain separation, not encourage contact. Something once crossed from the unseen into the seen, something that later generations wanted very carefully to control. And yet, the idea of Watchers does not disappear. It transforms. It becomes embedded into the architecture of heaven rather than the architecture of earth. The Watchers become stars, ancestors, angels, spirits. Their presence moves upward, outward, beyond reach, and humanity internalizes the relationship between knowledge and danger, between proximity and risk. This internalization appears most clearly in the figure of the shaman. Across cultures, the shaman becomes the regulated intermediary, someone permitted to cross boundaries under strict conditions, with ritual safeguards, with symbolic armor. The shaman is allowed to see what others cannot, but only after enduring initiation, suffering, symbolic death. Access becomes costly. The Watchers no longer descend freely. Humans must descend symbolically at great risk. This transition reflects a deeper shift. The Watchers have become too distant to encounter directly. humanity takes on the role of watcher in their absence, observing the world, interpreting signs, tracing patterns in the stars in an attempt to recover what was lost. Yet the memory of the watchers persists in subtle places, in the way alignments track celestial rhythms, in the way temples are oriented, in the way rituals evoke presence without expecting it. The watchers become part of the cosmic architecture rather than the earthly one, and in this shift a new layer of silence appears, a silence not of fear, but of resignation. A sense that whatever once stood beside humanity has stepped away, not in anger, but in necessity. The boundary was drawn, and the world adapted. But like all boundaries, this one leaves a trace, a faint imprint, a sense of something unfinished. And in that trace the question emerges, not spoken aloud, but lingering beneath the layers of history. If the watchers withdrew, did they do so because they were no longer welcome, or because their purpose was complete? There is a peculiar tension that runs through the oldest layers of human memory, an almost imperceptible vibration, as though something immense once moved through the early world and left faint ripples that have not yet settled. These ripples appear in places where they should not, in symbols carved before writing existed, in ruins that seem older than the civilizations built on top of them, in myths that speak with the confidence of eyewitness accounts, even when describing events far beyond the reach of recorded history. It is in these ripples that the presence of the watchers resurfaces, not as beings stepping down from the sky, but as a persistent imprint woven through the origins of cities, laws, and the first attempts to understand the cosmos. If the earlier parts of this journey explored their descent and the sudden ruptures that reshaped the relationship between humans and those who observed them, this moment in the narrative approaches a quieter but more profound question. What lingered after the departure? What remained in the world, in rituals, in the architecture of the early civilization that carried the echo of a presence no longer visible? For while the watchers may have withdrawn, the world they left behind did not reset to emptiness. Something endured, something subtle but pervasive. This endurance appears most clearly in the oldest cities. Cities by their nature are deliberate creations, not merely collections of dwellings, but reflections of cosmological order. Their layout, their orientation, their symbolic centres reveal not just the practical concerns of early humans, but their worldview. And in the earlier cities that worldview is astonishingly consistent across vast distances. Take Eridu, often regarded as the first true city in southern Mesopotamia. Its earliest layers show a temple sequence repeated over millennia, rebuilt again and again on the same sacred spot, as though maintaining alignment with a principle older than the city itself. The temple was not simply a structure, it was a point of connection, a marker of continuity. The earliest inhabitants believed this was the place where divine knowledge descended, where culture bearers taught humanity the arts of survival, where the boundary between the seen and unseen thinned. Even in its earliest form, the city is oriented not just around practical needs, but around a cosmological axis. Now shift thousands of kilometers to Egypt. The first ceremonial structures of the Nile Valley mirror the same impulse. Centers of early ritual activity, long predating the pyramids, align with cardinal points and celestial patterns. The city's architecture was not built merely to house people. It was built to reflect an order believed to have existed before humanity. The term Zep Tepi, the first time, evokes a period when beings of great knowledge walked the earth. The earliest Egyptian kings claimed not to innovate but to restore the order established in that mythical era. Further east, in the Indus Valley, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro exhibit a degree of urban planning that seems disproportionate to their time. Perfectly aligned streets, standardized bricks, an advanced drainage system, all appearing without a clear developmental lineage. The organization is deliberate, almost ritualistic, suggesting that the builders sought to mirror a pattern they did not invent. In China, early Longshan sites display ritual enclosures and cosmological layouts that predate writing by centuries, suggesting a memory being held through geometry rather than text. In Mesoamerica, the earliest Olmec centers align with astronomical directions, often in patterns reflecting cycles far longer than a human lifetime. Why does the same impulse, to model the city as a reflection of a cosmic order, appear in all these places? Why does it emerge so suddenly, so fully formed, so synchronized across continents? And why do these early civilizations describe their founders not as humans, but as beings who possessed knowledge that humanity had to rediscover again and again? It is here, in this convergence, that the idea of the Watchers transforms from mythic figures into something more akin to a cultural code, an invisible blueprint that shaped early human organization long after the presence that inspired it vanished. Because cities were not the only structures oriented in this way. Sacred sites, large and small, follow the same principle. Megalithic circles, burial mounds, stone alignments, underground chambers, all built with precision that should not have belonged to preliterate societies. All built with an understanding of seasonal cycles, stellar movements, and geometric relationships. In Ireland, Newgrange marks the winter solstice sunrise with precision that suggests centuries of astronomical observation. In Peru, Chanquillo marks the sun's annual movement through 13 towers that align with astonishing accuracy. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe aligns with celestial patterns far older than the city-based civilizations of the ancient Near East. In Namibia, the stone arrangements known as the fairy circles appear to mark astronomical positions. In Japan, the German stone circles reflect celestial events thousands of years before the emergence of the imperial state. These sites, like the early cities, reflect memory. Not memory in the sense of storytelling or myth, but memory embedded in space, encoded into stone, oriented toward the heavens, preserved without words. They reflect the impression of something that taught early humans to look upward, to observe the sky, to replicate harmony between heaven and earth. And yet, curiously, these structures also reflect something else, the absence of those who inspired them. For each site carries a sense of substitution, as though something once present had to be symbolically reconstructed after its withdrawal. It is in this sense that the Watchers linger not as figures, but as frameworks. And nowhere is this more visible than in the oldest myths of order and chaos. In ancient Egypt, the concept of Mayat, cosmic balance, emerges fully formed. Mayat is not merely the idea of order, it is the idea of an order that existed before humanity and was entrusted to humans by divine intermediaries. The role of the king was not to rule arbitrarily, but to maintain Ma'at, to uphold a balance inherited, not invented. In Mesopotamia, the Mi, fundamental principles of civilization, are described as having been brought from the abode of the gods to humans through intermediaries like Inanna or Enki. These principles govern everything from music to kingship, from weaving to justice. They are not created by humans, they are received. In the Vedic tradition, Rita, the cosmic order, predates humanity. Ancient hymns insist that sages did not discover Rita, they remembered it. In China, the mandate of heaven assumes a cosmic order in which rulers maintain harmony that does not originate with them. Early Shang burial sites contain oracle bones used to interpret the will of forces older than the dynasty itself. In the Americas, the cosmic order is expressed in the sacred directions, a pattern believed to reflect the organization of the world before humans inhabited it. These concepts, scattered yet consistent, imply that something, some memory, some instruction, once shaped the worldview of early societies so profoundly that the framework endured long after the details of its origin dissolved into symbol. But perhaps the most mysterious legacy of the Watchers lies not in the ground beneath ancient cities, or in the temples aligned with the sun, but in the stories of forbidden knowledge, knowledge that early cultures claimed was not meant for humans to possess too soon. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers teach metallurgy, cosmetics, astronomy, and enchantments. But what is often overlooked is that these are not magical tricks, they are early sciences. Metallurgy is the manipulation of matter. Astronomy is the measurement of time. Herbalism is pharmacology. Cosmology is physics expressed through metaphor. Why would such knowledge be portrayed as dangerous? Because knowledge accelerates complexity. Complexity accelerates imbalance. Archaeology shows that whenever a society gains sudden access to new knowledge, especially knowledge involving transformation of the environment, social structures shift rapidly. Inequality emerges. Warfare intensifies. Ritual becomes regulated. Priestly classes rise. Cities expand and collapse. Complexity spirals beyond the capacity of old traditions to contain it. Early myths speak of this danger openly, though metaphorically. The Watchers teach too much. Humanity grows too quickly. The balance breaks. Something must withdraw. Something must be sealed. Something must be forgotten. This motif appears even in cultures with no direct contact. The Maya describe a time when the ancestors received knowledge that clouded the heart. The Greeks speak of Prometheus bringing fire, a gift both divine and destructive. The Aboriginal narratives include tales of ancestral beings who teach humans the secrets of creation but warn them not to misuse it. In Polynesia, the demigod Maui attempts to extend human life, only for the effort to lead to loss rather than gain. The pattern suggests that ancient societies understood a principle we often overlook, that knowledge, once acquired, cannot be unlearned, and that the consequences of early discoveries ripple across generations. This may explain why the withdrawal of the Watchers is often associated with restrictions, taboo, and boundary making. It was not simply a departure, it was a protective measure, either for humanity or for the unseen order. Because after the Watchers withdrew, something else emerged in their place: the priesthood. Priests, unlike shamans, do not cross boundaries freely. They regulate access, they mediate, they codify. They preserve tradition while constraining innovation. The rise of priesthoods across early civilizations reflects a world in which the unseen had become dangerous or overwhelming. In Sumer, the Sangha priests take over the cosmological roles once attributed to divine intermediaries. In Egypt, the hereditary priesthoods become interpreters of hidden knowledge. In the Indus Valley, the uniformity of the seals suggests a regulated symbolic order. In China, the oracle bone priests mediate communication with the ancestral realm. In Mesoamerica, the priest-kings guard astronomical knowledge. It is as though humanity, left to its own devices, constructed systems to fill the vacuum left by the Watchers, a way to maintain connection to the unseen without reopening the boundary too widely. And yet, even as priesthoods consolidated power, the memory of the Watchers persisted. It persisted in the architecture of ziggurats and pyramids, in the orientation of ancient cities, in the rituals that reenact descent and ascent, in the myths that speak of a time when knowledge flowed freely. But there is another, darker legacy, one rarely spoken aloud: the idea that after the Watchers withdrew, not all who remained aligned with the original balance. Some traditions describe fallen beings, corrupted intermediaries, shadows of the original Watchers who remained after the rupture. These narratives appear in the Enochian texts as fallen Watchers. They appear in Mesopotamia as rebellious gods. They appear in Zoroastrianism as devas, beings who chose disorder. They appear in the Vedic tradition as asuras, forces of imbalance, often former gods. In Greek myth, the Titans are imprisoned, their strength redirected. In Central Asian lore, sky beings fall due to desire and lose their ability to ascend. These stories may not describe literal events, but they reveal a deep intuition that knowledge, once introduced into the human world, can be used in ways that distort as much as uplift. This distortion becomes visible in archaeology. Fortified settlements appear where none existed before. Weapons become more sophisticated. Ritual sacrifices escalate. Inequality sharpens. Cities become hierarchical. The cosmological alignment of early architecture becomes overshadowed by expressions of power. It is as though the early world, once oriented toward cosmic harmony, shifts toward human ambition. The Watchers are gone. But their absence is palpable, not just in what remains, but in what fractures. And yet, beneath the fractures, something endures, something quiet, something patient. A sense that humanity is still travelling along a path set in motion long before cities rose. A sense that the echoes of the Watchers live not in myth alone, but in the instincts that pull us toward the unknown, the drive to understand the cosmos, to measure time, to seek patterns, to build in alignment with something greater than ourselves. And perhaps it is this instinct that forms the final trace of the Watchers' presence, not the knowledge they left behind, but the longing they awakened, a longing to remember, a longing to reconnect, a longing to understand what was once offered, then withdrawn. For even in their absence the Watchers remain, not as figures, not as teachers, but as the unanswered question at the heart of human history. There is a peculiar stillness that settles over the deepest historical transitions, a stillness that suggests not the absence of movement, but the presence of something deliberately concealed. When studying the earlier civilizations, one notices this stillness like pressure behind the walls of a sealed chamber. It is the moment when the familiar light of human innovation dims, and another, older glow seeps through the cracks. That glow is not the brilliance of a new discovery, but the fading echo of something inherited, something remembered briefly then lost again. It is in this fading that the legacy of the Watchers becomes most visible, for the more their presence retreats, the more their imprint lingers in strange indirect ways throughout ancient memory. If earlier chapters of this journey traced their descent, their guidance, and the rupture that drove them into concealment, this moment turns toward the aftermath, toward the period when humanity, left without direct contact, began shaping its world by reconstructing fragments rather than receiving instruction. This reconstruction was neither seamless nor uniform. It occurred unevenly, erupting in bursts of brilliance and collapsing into periods of darkness. The pattern is unmistakable. Humanity was remembering, not discovering. This is visible first in the realm of sacred knowledge, particularly in the sudden emergence of mystery traditions. These traditions, scattered across continents and separated by wide differences in culture, share a strange and telling structure. They speak not of new revelations, but of old truths that must be recovered, protected, or reenacted. They carry the tone of memory, not invention. Consider the Egyptian mysteries of Osiris performed at Abydos. These rituals involve reenactments of resurrection, cyclic renewal, and the restoration of cosmic balance. The priests insisted that these rites preserved the most ancient knowledge of the gods, knowledge passed down from a previous age. Yet the myths surrounding Osiris contain details that seem older than the agricultural world in which they were recorded, as if they were reinterpreted remnants of something predating dynastic Egypt. Or take the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece, which persisted for nearly 2,000 years. Initiates spoke of a revelation so significant that it changed their understanding of life and death. Yet the tradition insisted that the knowledge was not Greek at all. It came from a distant past, from a time when beings who understood the cycles of nature walked among humans. In Persia, the mystic lineage associated with Zoroaster also speaks of an ancient teaching renewed. Zoroaster himself claims not to invent but to restore the primordial truth, Asha, the cosmic order, something that existed before human memory. In India, the Upanishads describe knowledge passed down through a chain of teachers that stretches into pre-human times, knowledge that precedes both writing and civilization. The concept of Shruti, that which was heard, implies that the earlier sages did not create wisdom, but received it, as echoes from a world no longer visible. In Mesoamerica, Olmec and Maya mystery traditions speak of precedent worlds, cycles of creation and destruction. They do not treat their cosmology as innovation, but as restoration, remembering what the ancestors once knew. Everywhere, the tone is the same. Humanity is rebuilding something that once existed in full. This raises a question not of what the Watchers were, but of what they left behind. Because what persists after their withdrawal is not knowledge itself, it is structure, a template, a way of thinking that humanity inherited without understanding its origin. One example of this structure is the sudden appearance of numerical systems that reflect astronomical cycles far larger than any one civilization could have observed independently. The Sumerians used a base 60 system, whose influence remains in how we measure time and angles. The Maya developed the long count calendar, tracking cycles spanning thousands of years. The Vedic tradition speaks of cycles lasting millions or billions of years. The Chinese recorded cosmological eras long predating their own dynasties. Why did early civilizations develop clocks for cosmic time, scales irrelevant to their short lifespans and simple material cultures, unless they were inheriting frameworks embedded long before? There is a similar pattern in sacred geometry. The golden ratio appears in structures across the globe, sometimes in cultures with no evidence of contact. Pi and Phi relationships emerge in constructions as diverse as the Great Pyramid, Stonehenge, Teotihuacan, the Temple of Hatshepsut, and even early Chinese courtyard plans. These are not coincidental patterns. They require observation, measurement, and intentional design. Yet the people who built these structures often left no explanation for their mathematical sophistication. The knowledge appears abruptly, used widely, and then disappears or becomes restricted. What does this suggest? Not accidental discovery, not gradual evolution, but inheritance, applied long after the memory of the original instructors had faded. Perhaps the most enigmatic legacy of the Watchers, however, lies in the realm of transformation rites, those rituals that involve symbolic death and rebirth. These rites appear worldwide, independent of culture, time, or geography. The initiate undergoes disorientation, darkness, symbolic dismemberment, and finally illumination. In these ceremonies, the initiate enters a space where the boundary between worlds blurs for a moment, not to encounter beings directly, but to reenact the moment when boundaries were first drawn. In ancient Egypt, this is the journey through the duat, the unseen realm. In Greece, it is the descent into the underworld. In the Vedic tradition, it is the journey through the layers of the self. In the Maya tradition, the initiate descends into the realm of the dead before emerging transformed. In Siberian shamanic rites, the body is symbolically dismantled and reconstructed. Why does the same ritual pattern appear everywhere? Why does initiation universally involve the breaking and reassembling of identity? Because transformation mirrors the rupture humanity experienced when the Watchers withdrew. The world before their withdrawal was one of permeability. Boundaries were thin, knowledge flowed freely. The world after was full of partitions, psychological, spiritual, cosmological. The initiate's journey symbolically reenacts the passage through that divide, not to restore the old world, but to glimpse the memory of it. Yet even as humanity preserved fragments of the Watcher's influence, another development began to emerge. Something new, something distinctly human. Complexity increased, cities expanded, writing became widespread, priesthoods grew powerful. But with complexity came tension. This tension appears vividly in the archaeological record around 2500–1500 BCE, a period marked by large-scale disruptions. Entire regions undergo collapse. The Old Kingdom of Egypt falters, the Akkadian Empire dissolves, the Indus Valley cities empty out, the Minoan civilization suffers disaster, and massive migrations reshape the Middle East and Europe. These collapses are often attributed to climate change, warfare, or economic shifts. But beneath the material explanations one finds a subtler pattern, a fragmentation of the older cosmological orders, a breakdown of the frameworks that once bound societies to the rhythms of the heavens. For though the priesthoods inherited the structures left by the Watchers, they did not always understand them fully. Over generations, symbolic knowledge hardened into dogma. Ritual became mechanical. Cosmic frameworks became tools of political power. And the more societies sought to assert control over the unseen world, the further they drifted from the memory of the Watchers, who had once approached knowledge with restraint. When the rupture deepened, new myths arose, not myths of descent but myths of exile. These myths speak of beings cast out, not beings who chose to withdraw. In many cultures, these exiled beings become demons, fallen angels, titans, asuras, figures who once possessed knowledge but now exist in opposition to cosmic order. They represent the distortion of memory, the fear that knowledge itself might be corrupted. What is striking is that these myths often describe the fallen not as inherently evil, but as those who misused knowledge or entered the human world in ways that broke the balance. These narratives preserve in symbolic form humanity's lingering anxiety about the Watcher's legacy, that knowledge can uplift or destroy, heal or disrupt. Even so, not all memory of the Watchers darkened. In many traditions, their presence softened into the role of guardians, not teachers now, but protectors from afar. The Egyptians retained the concept of the Aku, luminous beings who watch over the world from the realm of the blessed. The Greeks imagined demons, spirits neither divine nor mortal, guiding human lives. The Persians described Fravashis, guardian presences that predated humanity. Early Christianity preserved the concept of guardian angels. Even in Taoist tradition, there are immortals who observe from remote mountains, intervening only when balance falters. It is as though cultural memory preserved two impressions of the Watchers, those who descended and those who withdrew. But the most mysterious traces appear not in myths but in artifacts that defy simple explanations. Consider the undeciphered scripts scattered across the ancient world, symbols etched into clay, stone, and bone, but never fully understood. The Indus script remains unreadable. The Vincha symbols predate writing by millennia, yet bear patterns too structured to be decorative. The Rongorongo of Easter Island remains enigmatic. The symbols at Göbekli Tepe reflect a visual language far older than the societies capable of carving them. Are these scripts attempts to capture something older, attempts to stabilize memory at the moment when the watcher's presence faded? Some scholars argue that undeciphered writing systems reflect indigenous developments. Others propose that they encode symbolic, not linguistic information. But there is another possibility, one that aligns with the subtle pattern of loss surrounding the watchers. These scripts represent the residues of knowledge systems whose key was already missing. They are echoes without source, syllables without sound, symbols without context. When the watchers withdrew, they did not erase their legacy. They left frameworks, cosmological, mathematical, ritualistic, but the interpretive key vanished. Over generations, humanity preserved the structures but lost the meaning. The fragments hardened into mystery traditions, sacred symbols, astronomical alignments, and myths of descent, and beneath them all lies a quiet, persistent intuition that something essential is missing. This intuition appears across philosophies. Plato speaks of anamnesis, the idea that learning is remembering. The Upanishads speak of vidya, knowledge that must be uncovered within the self, not acquired. Taoist sages speak of returning to the origin. The Maya speak of recovering the heart of the sky. The Dogon speak of knowledge hidden until humanity is ready. Each tradition expresses the same impulse. We are searching for something once given, then lost. But what is most haunting is that even as human societies advanced, building empires, developing philosophy, mapping the world, this intuition never left. The sense of incompletion, of something missing, persists even now. It is the foundation of every quest, every scientific inquiry, every spiritual pursuit. Because the Watcher's greatest legacy was not architecture, astronomy, or mathematics. It was longing. A longing for the origin, a longing for coherence, a longing to bridge the boundary that once opened freely. Humanity inherited not the memory of the Watchers, but the absence of that memory, the empty space where it once resided. That space compels search, curiosity, exploration. It is the driving engine of culture, and in that sense the Watchers never truly disappeared. Their imprint lives on not in myths alone, but in the hunger for understanding that defines the human journey, a hunger awakened by presence and sharpened by withdrawal, which leads to a final lingering tension. If the Watchers left because the boundary had been broken, or because humanity was not yet ready, then their absence is not an ending, but a threshold, and thresholds are not permanent. They wait. There is a moment in the study of ancient memory when the silence itself begins to take on a structure, as if the absence were not merely the erosion of time, but the result of something placed carefully out of reach. This structure is not physical. It does not appear in ruins or artifacts or inscriptions. It emerges instead in the uncanny consistency of certain myths, the architectural logic of certain sacred sites, the rituals that reenact moments no living witness could possibly have seen. It emerges most clearly in the persistent human intuition that there was once a nearness to something, some presence, some order, some intelligence that no longer walks among us in the open. What makes this intuition remarkable is not that it exists, but that it exists everywhere. In the deepest traditions of the world, one finds the same motif, that the earliest generations interacted with beings who did not belong wholly to the human world. These beings are not gods in the later formalized sense. They are not ancestors. They are intermediaries, watchers, guardians, teachers or custodians, who operated before the boundaries between worlds were fully sealed. And in many of these traditions, the withdrawal of these beings is described not as a single event, but as a gradual dimming, a slow closing of the door between realms. If earlier parts of this journey trace the arc of their presence and the legacy they left behind, this moment enters the deeper shadow that follows their departure, a shadow filled not with emptiness, but with distortions, echoes, and faint impressions that humanity tried to interpret long after the original context had vanished. The period after the Watcher's withdrawal is not simply a time of forgetting. It is a time of substitution. Humanity did not step into a void. it stepped into a world where memory slipped, symbols hardened, and interpretation became both necessary and perilous. This is visible first in the rise of sacred intermediaries, figures who emerge in the mythologies of many cultures after the Watchers disappear. These figures are prophets, sages, or culture heroes who reintroduce fragments of knowledge, but never with the fullness or clarity associated with the earliest pre-withdrawal era. They appear like torches carried through a darkened landscape, illuminating small paths but not revealing the entire terrain. In ancient Mesopotamia, the figure of Adapa, described as wise like one of the gods, receives knowledge from divine beings but is denied immortality. The story is not about punishment, but about limitation. The boundary that once allowed free movement between worlds is now restrictive. Knowledge flows only in fragments, and those fragments come with conditions. In Egypt, the figure of Thoth emerges as a mediator of knowledge, preserving sacred information but distributing it selectively. The later priesthoods emphasize that certain texts are not to be read by all, that specific rituals are reserved for trained initiates. The Watchers have receded, and the hierarchy grows in their absence. In the Greek world, Hermes takes on the role of messenger between realms, guiding souls, carrying secrets, mediating exchanges, but never revealing the full structure of the cosmos. The mysteries come to depend on intermediaries precisely because the earlier channels have closed. In India, the rishis receive knowledge through Shruti, but always as transmission, never direct encounter. The gods are distant. Revelation is auditory, not visual. Human beings can hear echoes, but they no longer stand in the same space as the bearers of the original knowledge. In China, the mythical sage kings, Fu Xi, Shenong, Huangdi, are described as discoverers of principles that feel archetypal, almost mathematical. But even these figures operate within a framework of rediscovery, not direct instruction from otherworldly beings. Their teachings come through dreams, meditations, or encounters with symbolic animals, not through face-to-face instruction. In the Americas, Quetzalcoatl is described not as a god who remained with the people, but as one who departed after teaching them foundational principles. His departure mirrors that of the Watchers, an exit that carries a promise of return, but a return always deferred. These intermediaries represent the first layer of substitution, human figures stepping into roles once filled by beings whose presence radiated beyond ordinary perception. But beneath this substitution lies a deeper transformation, one that reshaped the psychological and symbolic landscape of humanity. After the Watchers' withdrawal, dreams begin to take on new significance in ancient texts. Dreams become the meeting place between worlds, the only location where humans can still glimpse something beyond the physical. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes dreams as messages from the gods. Egyptian inscriptions treat dreams as windows into the unseen. In Greek thought, dreams are the territory of daimones, messengers who carry fragments of truth. It is as though the human mind itself became the last remaining threshold after the external ones closed. This threshold, however, is unstable. Dreams are ambiguous. They cannot be verified. They can be influenced by fear, desire, and memory, and so humanity's connection to the unseen becomes fragile, mediated by symbols, visions, and altered states rather than by direct encounter. This fragility shapes the next stage of human cultures, the rise of divination. Divination is not simply a tool for prediction. It is an attempt to re-establish communication with forces that once walked the earth. But because the Watchers no longer appear in person, divination requires interpretation, pattern recognition in noise. Oracles, omens, star charts, ritual casting all attempt to reconstruct a message whose sender has vanished. In Mesopotamia, liver divination reflects the belief that cosmic order reveals itself through organic patterns. In Egypt, astrological texts emerge to decode the movements of the heavens. In China, oracle bone inscriptions seek answers from ancestors and spirits through cracks in heated shells. In Greece, the Pythia at Delphi enters altered states to articulate riddles believed to contain divine will. These practices reveal not superstition but longing. Humanity builds systems of interpretation because the direct voice of the Watchers has receded. The priesthoods become interpreters of absence. Yet the deeper one studies these systems, the more apparent it becomes that they are layered on top of something older. embedded structures from a time when the boundary between worlds was permeable. For instance, many divination traditions rely on geometric, numerical, or cosmological patterns that appear disproportionately advanced for the cultures that used them. The I Ching of China, based on binary sequences, anticipates concepts fundamental to mathematics and computation. The Sumerian astrological system anticipates celestial patterns with precision. The Mayan calendar tracks cycles spanning thousands of years. The Egyptian decans reflect stellar patterns visible only after prolonged observation. These systems are too coherent, too ancient, and too synchronized across continents to be inventions of isolated societies. They are reinterpretations of older frameworks transmitted before the Watchers withdrew, but the most haunting legacy of this reinterpretation appears not in divination, but in the rise of mythic dualism. The idea that the unseen realm contains both guardians and adversaries, protectors and corruptors. Before the Watchers' withdrawal, myths do not typically frame the unseen world in terms of moral conflict. The earliest stories depict the Watchers as guides or observers, not combatants in a cosmic war. But after the withdrawal, a new narrative structure emerges. The realm beyond becomes a battleground. In the Near East, the conflict between angels and fallen Watchers becomes central to the Enochian literature. In Persia, the struggle between Ahuras and Devas defines Zoroastrian cosmology. In India, the Devas and Asuras represent forces of order and disorder. In Greece, the Titans and Olympians fight for cosmic control. In Central Asia, sky spirits battle chaotic beings from the underworld. This dualism reflects not only a shift in cosmology, but a psychological shadow cast by the Watcher's absence. When the bearers of knowledge depart, the vacuum they leave behind becomes a place where fear can take root. Human imagination fills that space with conflict, division, uncertainty. But what is most striking is that even in the midst of this new dualism, ancient traditions retain a memory of equilibrium, of a time when order and chaos were not moral opposites, but complementary principles. Many cultures insist that earlier ages did not suffer the dichotomy that later myths impose. Balance was maintained not through prescriptive law, but through proximity, through the presence of beings who embodied that balance. After their departure, humanity attempts to replicate that balance through ritual, architecture, and legal codes. But the reconstruction is incomplete. The templates remain, the living memory does not. This incompleteness is clearest in the evolution of sacred architecture. Before the Watchers' withdrawal, sacred sites like Göbekli Tepe emphasize openness, circles, enclosures without roofs, spaces where earth and sky meet. After the withdrawal, sacred architecture becomes enclosed, stratified, hierarchical. Temples are built with inner chambers, restricted sanctuaries, forbidden zones. Access to the center is limited. Sacred space contracts. This contraction reflects the contraction of cosmological access. The sanctuaries become symbolic replicas of a cosmos that humans can no longer experience directly. They mirror the structure of a universe whose order has become distant, whose meaning must now be inferred rather than witnessed. But perhaps the most telling transformation occurs in the realm of law. Many of the earliest law codes, Hammurabi's Code, the Egyptian Mat principles, the Vedic Dharma, the early Chinese legal systems, claim divine or cosmic origin. But this claim often comes with a subtext. The laws are reflections of an order that once existed naturally, not inventions to impose artificial structure. The law is a memory of cosmic alignment. This suggests that early legal systems were not merely tools of governance but attempts to model, symbolically, a harmony lost when the Watchers withdrew. They are echoes of a world where order was not enforced but embodied. Yet as centuries pass, the echo becomes faint. The Watchers fade into legend, then into metaphor, then into faint traces embedded in ritual gestures and sacred narratives. But the human world does not return to simplicity. Complexity increases, empires rise, writing spreads, bureaucracy expands, the world becomes dense, layered, abstract. The Watcher's influence dissolves into hidden currents beneath the surface. And in the midst of this complexity, a new anxiety emerges. The fear that the Watcher's withdrawal was not a passive event, but a judgment. This anxiety reverberates through apocalyptic traditions. The days of Noah become a symbol of transgression. The destruction of Atlantis in Plato's account becomes a warning. The fall of past ages, Yuga cycles, world ages, sons of creation, becomes a recurring motif of lost equilibrium. In many of these traditions, the Watchers are remembered not only as teachers but as judges, beings who withdrew because humanity crossed boundaries it was not prepared to cross. Their departure becomes associated with catastrophe, floods, fires, migrations, collapses. Whether these events were literal or symbolic does not diminish their psychological impact. The memory of the Watchers becomes intertwined with the memory of loss. Yet even in this context of anxiety, the Watchers do not disappear entirely. Their presence transforms into something subtler, more enigmatic. They become symbols of potentiality, figures who may return when the cycles align, when humanity is ready, when the boundaries thin once more. This motif appears across cultures. The return of Quetzalcoatl, the return of the Egyptian Shemsu-Hor, the return of the Mahdi, the return of the Kalki avatar, the return of the hidden teacher in Persian mystical traditions, the return of the Chinese sage king, the return of the Hopi Pahana. These returns are not merely eschatological fantasies, they reflect an ancient intuition that the story is not finished, that the withdrawal was not final, that the Watchers remain in some form, distant, hidden, but attuned. It is this intuition that shapes the final arc of their legacy, the belief that the boundary between worlds is a veil, not a wall, a veil that thins at certain times, solstices, equinoxes, eclipses, transitional periods, a veil that shimmers in dreams, in altered states, in the liminal moments between waking and sleeping. This veil is the final inheritance, the last remaining connection. It is where the memory of the Watchers resides, not in texts, not in ruins, but in the quiet human sense that the world is larger than it appears. And so, as humanity moves further from the earliest eras, as the Watchers' presence fades into the deepening currents of time, a new kind of awareness begins to emerge. An awareness that the absence itself is a message, that the silence is not empty but intentional, that the Watchers did not abandon the world but stepped beyond reach, leaving the faintest of imprints for those who look carefully. A trace in geometry, a pattern in myth, a structure in ritual, a longing in the human heart, a reminder that something once stood beside us and may still be watching. From a distance, humanity is only beginning to sense again. There is a certain threshold one crosses when tracing the subtle residues of the Watchers, a point where the inquiry no longer concerns only archaeology, mythology, or historical memory, but the strange territories where perception, consciousness, and the fabric of reality itself begin to mingle. It is here, in this liminal space between the inner and outer worlds, that the next stage of their legacy unfolds, not as physical traces or architectural alignments, but as impressions carried within the human mind. For after their withdrawal from the visible world, the Watchers did not vanish entirely. Something of their presence seeped inward, into the domain of dreams, intuition, inspiration, and the uncanny patterns that have shaped human thought from the earliest ages. If previous parts of this journey followed the arc of descent, rupture, and the emergence of substitutes after their departure, this moment turns toward the interior spaces where their echo continued to vibrate long after the last physical traces faded. For what is most mysterious is not that the Watchers withdrew, but that humanity, in every culture, responded to their absence in the same quiet, instinctive way. By turning inward, searching the mind, the soul, the unseen for the place where the lost connection might still flicker. This inward turn marks one of the most profound transitions in early human history, and it manifests in something that at first seems paradoxical: the sudden rise of introspective knowledge. Before agriculture, before writing, before states and empires, humanity's attention was directed outward, toward survival, movement, and the rhythms of the land. But after the era associated with the Watchers, something changed. Humans began exploring inner worlds with a focus that appears disproportionate to their material conditions. Cave paintings from later periods depict not just external events, but symbolic visions, spirals, geometric forms, beings half seen, half imagined. Burial practices become elaborate, reflecting a deep concern with consciousness beyond death. Ritual specialists begin to emerge, individuals capable of entering altered states, of crossing boundaries not physically but mentally. It is difficult to explain why this introspective turn occurred so abruptly. Some scholars attribute it to changing social structures, others to the trauma of ecological upheaval. Yet the timing aligns uncannily with the period when myths insist that the boundary between worlds was sealed. Perhaps the withdrawal of external contact threw open a new threshold inside the human psyche, one that had always existed but was not previously necessary. When the outer guides disappeared, the inner landscape awakened. One of the clearest expressions of this awakening appears in the earliest spiritual technologies, techniques of breath, posture, sound, isolation, sensory deprivation, rhythmic movement. These techniques allow ordinary consciousness to shift into altered states where visions emerge. Similar practices appear in Siberian shamanism, early Vedic rituals, Greek oracular rites, African trance ceremonies, pre-Columbian initiation processes, and indigenous Australian songlines. What is striking is not merely that these techniques exist, but that they reveal a shared intuition, that the mind, when properly guided, can access a dimension of reality no longer open to ordinary perception. This intuition is universal. It crosses geography, time, culture. It is as though humanity remembered a door that had once opened freely, and sought new ways to approach it from within. In the earliest Vedic hymns, the sages describe Di Astul, the luminous insight that comes not from logic but from an inner opening. In Egypt, priests speak of the hidden chamber of the heart, where divine images appear in silence. In Greece, philosophers seek gnosis, an inner knowing that transcends rational thought. In China, the concept of Jin, heart-mind, becomes the center of metaphysical inquiry. In the Jewish mystical tradition, the bat kol is a faint echo of divine voice, heard not externally but within. In Mesoamerica, shamans journey into the place of mirrors, a realm of reflection and revelation. These traditions insist that something of the Watcher's presence lingers in the human mind, not in memory, but in capacity. The capacity to perceive beyond ordinary reality, the capacity to sense patterns invisible to logic, the capacity to open doors that biology alone cannot fully explain. This raises a question too subtle for archaeology and too unsettling for orthodox history. Did the Watchers, intentionally or unintentionally, leave an imprint on human consciousness? Not a biological change, not a genetic transformation, but a cognitive orientation, a predisposition to seek the unseen, to question the visible world, to search for meaning in patterns beyond immediate survival. Such an imprint would explain why, after their withdrawal, humanity became obsessed not only with the heavens above but with the heavens within. It would explain the simultaneous rise of philosophy, mysticism, mathematics, and sacred art. It would explain the intuition of unity, the sense of longing, the impulse toward transcendence that permeates every civilization's earliest teachings. Long after physical contact ended, the Watcher's echo persisted as a kind of metaphysical tension, an awareness of absence that pushes the mind to search for the presence that once filled that space. This tension becomes especially visible in the figure of the sage, the prophet, the mystic, the person who claims not to invent truth but to recover it. These individuals emerge everywhere shortly after the Watcher's era fades into myth. They speak of forgotten wisdom, of ancient principles, of laws older than nations. They describe the world not as chaotic but as structured, intelligent, permeated with hidden order. The earliest Upanishadic sages insist that the highest knowledge cannot be taught in words but must be recollected through disciplined introspection. Laozi speaks of the Tao as something forgotten by the people, something obscured by the rise of social rules. Pythagoras claims his teachings are not new, but restorations of primordial truths. The Buddhist tradition describes awakening as the remembrance of one's true nature. Indigenous Australian elders speak of the old way, a knowledge remembered through ceremony. Even in early Christian writings, there are hints that certain truths predate the scripture, truths preserved in parable and symbol. Why do so many traditions equate wisdom with remembering rather than discovering? Because remembering implies an origin, and origins draw the mind back toward a presence that once illuminated the world. But this presence did not remain intact after the Watchers withdrew. Memory fractured, symbols multiplied, interpretation replaced experience, The unseen world became a territory accessed only through the mind, and this territory proved far more ambiguous than direct encounter. This ambiguity gave rise to a phenomenon that historians often overlook: the spread of visionary error. After the Watchers faded, humanity became vulnerable to misinterpretation. The inner world, once a place where the unseen could be approached clearly, became cluttered with personal fears, desires, and projections. Visionaries struggled to distinguish between authentic insight and psychological noise. This is evident in the earliest recorded dreams, oracles, and mystical texts. Bright visions mingle with dark distortions. Figures of light appear beside chaotic entities. Revelation and delusion intertwine. This confusion reflects a subtle truth. When the Watchers departed, they left behind not a closed door but a fractured threshold. The boundary was still permeable, just not in the stable, coherent way it had once been. This fracturing appears symbolically in countless myths that describe the veil between worlds splitting, dimming, or becoming clouded. In Mesopotamia, the gates of heaven are said to close partially, not fully. In Egypt, the duat grows more complex, requiring more elaborate rituals to navigate. In Hindu cosmology, the clarity of the earlier yugas diminishes, making insight harder to attain. In Greek myth, the Golden Age gives way to ages of increasing distance from divine presence. The mind becomes the last refuge of the Watcher's echo, but the echo is faint and easily confused. This confusion gives rise to the next phase of human development: the construction of symbolic systems designed to stabilize interpretation. Writing systems encode cosmology, rituals encode memory, sacred art encodes metaphysics, numbers encode proportion, geometry encodes harmony, myth encodes archetypes. These systems do not restore direct contact, but they preserve structure. They provide a framework through which humanity can navigate the unseen without losing itself in chaos. Yet, even as these symbolic systems proliferate, something else begins to surface. Another ripple in the long shadow of the Watchers: the emergence of anomalies in human creativity. Innovations appear suddenly, seemingly without precedent. Entire symbolic languages emerge fully formed. Philosophical insights arise in individuals with no teachers. Mystical revelations occur spontaneously, unconnected to any tradition. These anomalies suggest a deeper principle, that whatever the Watchers imparted did not vanish when they departed. It continued to vibrate beneath the surface of human consciousness, emerging unpredictably in individuals whose minds were somehow attuned to the older resonance. One sees this in the isolated genius of Pythagoras, who claimed mathematical truths came to him through visions. One sees it in the meditative insights of the Buddha, who remembered knowledge said to lie beyond birth. One sees it in the intuitive leaps of early astronomers who correctly mapped celestial cycles with no access to long-term observations. One sees it in the geometric sophistication of Gothic cathedrals, whose builders used proportions derived from ancient pre-Christian sources. One sees it in indigenous shamans who describe visions of cosmic order that echo cosmologies half a world away. These patterns are not evidence of diffusion or contact across societies, but of something deeper: the mind remembering without knowing that it remembers. This is the Watcher's subtlest legacy, an imprint not on the world but on the mind, an imprint that awakens randomly, unpredictably, like sparks in a darkened room. This imprint is also visible in the human fascination with thresholds, doorways, portals, liminal states, transitions. Every ancient culture develops rituals for crossing boundaries, whether physical, psychological, or spiritual. Puberty rites, funerary ceremonies, marriage rituals, ascetic initiations all reenact the moment of passing from one world into another. Why this obsession with crossing? Because the earliest humans lived in a world where boundaries were porous. After the Watchers left, that porosity became mythologized, ritualized, symbolized, but never forgotten. Humans remembered the crossing, even if they no longer experienced it. This memory shaped not only religion but art. The earliest sculptures often depict hybrid forms, half human, half animal, suggesting beings that traversed the boundary between realms. Later art shifts toward symbolic geometry, mandalas, labyrinths, patterns that guide the mind inward toward the threshold. Even music reflects this legacy. Ancient flutes, drums, lyres, and chants are tuned to frequencies associated with trance, introspection, and resonance. Across the world, the human mind becomes the new meeting ground between seen and unseen. Yet this meeting ground is unstable, shaped by both brilliance and distortion. Mystics and visionaries describe their experiences as both enlightening and terrifying. In many cultures, individuals who wander too close to the thresholds risk madness. The boundary is thin, but it is no longer guided by the steady presence of watchers. Humanity approaches it alone, uncertain, vulnerable. This vulnerability explains the rise of protective rituals, charms, seals, incantations, sacred geometries meant to stabilize the mind during inner exploration. Such practices appear in ancient Babylonian incantation bowls, Egyptian amulets, Tibetan mandalas, Greek magical papyri, Celtic knot designs, and Islamic talismans. They all perform the same function, to create order in a realm where order once existed naturally. They are not superstitions. They are technological responses to metaphysical instability. And their universality suggests that humanity collectively sensed the same danger. The inner world, without proper guidance, can fracture. Yet there is another interpretation of this fracturing, one that aligns with the Watcher's original role. Perhaps the purpose of their withdrawal was not abandonment but maturation. If the Watcher's presence had remained constant, humanity might never have developed its own symbolic systems, its own philosophical traditions, its own artistic expressions. Without distance, there is no introspection. Without silence, no listening. Without absence, no longing. The Watcher's departure created a vacuum, and into that vacuum flowed human creativity, ingenuity, and spiritual striving. Their presence guided, their absence shaped. This paradox becomes even clearer when examining the rise of theoretical thought. Philosophy, mathematics, metaphysics, cosmology. These disciplines emerge not in the earliest eras of human history, when the Watchers were said to be present, but after they withdraw, as if the clarity of direct contact had prevented humans from needing abstraction. But once the clarity faded, abstraction became essential. Abstraction is the mind's attempt to recreate what cannot be seen, and so philosophy becomes a kind of memory work. The pre-Socratic philosophers describe the cosmos as if recalling something half forgotten. Heraclitus speaks of a hidden harmony behind all things. Parmenides describes reality as a unified, unchanging truth glimpsed through inner vision. Plato speaks openly of recollection, anamnesis, insisting that learning is remembering truths known before birth. It is difficult to dismiss these parallels as coincidence. The philosophical idea that humanity once possessed knowledge before birth, knowledge that must be remembered through discipline, mirrors the mythic claim that early humans received knowledge from Watchers. The memory in both cases is symbolic rather than literal, but the pattern aligns. An ancient knowing, a rupture, a gradual recovery through introspection. Perhaps the Watcher's final gift was not knowledge itself, but the longing for knowledge. A longing that becomes the engine of human consciousness. For longing is not an absence. It is a direction. It points towards something. And even though that something may no longer be accessible, the longing itself shapes civilizations. It shapes religions that seek the divine. It shapes philosophies that seek truth. It shapes sciences that seek pattern. It shapes arts that seek meaning. It shapes myths that seek origin. This longing is the Watcher's lingering imprint, the invisible thread woven through the human story. And as humanity advances, developing complex societies, exploring the world, mapping the heavens, this longing deepens. It becomes the quiet undertone of history, the question that whispers beneath every achievement. What are we trying to recover? For even now, millennia after the Watchers faded into myth, the imprint remains. It appears in the dreams that feel older than one's own life, in the instinct that reality is larger than it appears, in the sudden intuition, in the symbol that resonates, in the sense that human consciousness extends beyond its biological boundaries, a trace of something once near, a memory with no origin, a presence behind the veil. And so the Watcher's story does not end with their withdrawal. It continues through the human mind, through the inner landscapes shaped by their faint, enduring echo, a resonance that has guided humanity not through proximity, but through absence. Not through instruction, but through longing. Not through presence, but through the space they left behind. A space that still calls to us, quietly, as if the boundary between worlds is thinner than it seems, and waiting. There are moments in the long arc of human history when the visible world seems to tremble, not literally, not with the force of earthquakes or storms, but with a subtle shift in its underlying tone, as though something once held tightly in the depths of memory rises briefly toward the surface before sinking again. These tremors do not leave artifacts or inscriptions. They leave impressions, strange coincidences, parallel discoveries, sudden bursts of insight in individuals with no teachers, architectural repetitions across continents, myths that echo each other despite oceans of distance. And if one looks closely at these tremors, at these faint pulses moving through the fabric of time, one begins to notice a pattern. Humanity periodically brushes against something that feels older than itself. It is in these quiet disturbances, these pulses, that the presence of the Watchers reappears, not in flesh or form, but as a kind of resonance woven into human development. For though the Watchers withdrew long ago, their influence did not end abruptly. It dissolved slowly, like fading light at the edge of a horizon. And what remained after their departure was not merely memory or longing or fragments of knowledge. It was a subtle relational imprint between humanity and the unseen architecture of reality. This relational imprint is most evident in moments when humanity, without clear reason, begins searching for meaning on a deeper structural level. Not survival, not power, not conquest, but coherence, a sense of belonging to a cosmos that feels organized, intelligent, permeated with purpose. This search intensifies in periods of turbulence, after collapses, migrations, catastrophes, when external structures fail and internal ones must take their place. If the previous part traced the Watcher's lingering echo within the human mind, this part turns toward the ways that echo amplified in collective shifts, times when entire societies began aligning themselves with unseen principles as though responding to a signal that no one could consciously interpret. These moments acted like synchronizing waves, bringing scattered communities into parallel lines of development, despite having no contact with one another. One such wave appears around the middle of the first millennium BCE, a period often described by historians as the Axial Age. Without shared communication or common catalyst, profound philosophical, spiritual, and metaphysical traditions emerged simultaneously across distant cultures. In Greece, thinkers like Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and later Socrates and Plato began questioning the nature of reality, the soul and cosmic order. In India, the Upanishads crystallized into philosophical texts exploring consciousness and transcendence. In China, Laozi and Confucius articulated principles of harmony, virtue, and the Tao. In Persia, Zoroaster articulated a dualistic cosmology balancing truth and deception. In Palestine, the earliest prophetic movements emphasized moral transformation and divine justice. These developments were not mere cultural evolution. They were leaps, sudden increases in conceptual complexity that defy simple explanation. The patterns reappear independently, with parallel structures, similar metaphors, and shared questions. How does one explain such simultaneous awakening? Some scholars suggest trade networks or climate shifts. Others view it as coincidence. But there is another possibility hinted at in myths across these very cultures, that the Watchers had once oriented humanity toward an underlying cosmic relationship, and that in their absence, the echo of that orientation resurfaced naturally when the world reached certain thresholds of instability or introspection. In this interpretation, the Axial Age becomes not a beginning, but a resurfacing, a reintegration of something long dormant. Evidence for this resurfacing appears not only in philosophy, but in ritual transformation. Across Eurasia, ascetic movements take shape, individuals leaving society to seek truth in solitude. These movements do not arise because of social decline. They arise because something in the psyche begins craving direct contact with origins. The same pattern emerges later in Christianity's desert hermits, in Sufi mystics wandering through the sandy solitude, in Taoist recluses on hidden mountains, in shamans of the Americas who retreat into wilderness to seek visions. Withdrawal mirrors withdrawal. As the Watchers had once withdrawn from humanity, humanity began withdrawing from the world to trace the echo of their absence. In these acts of withdrawal, mystics claimed to encounter presences, not defined beings, not gods in the formal sense, but flashes of insight, symbols, archetypal figures, inner voices, silent guides. These experiences shaped the world's great mystical traditions, which in turn shaped civilization. Yet what is most intriguing is that these mystical experiences often come with the same message. Humanity once knew something that it has forgotten. Not a doctrine, not a ritual, but a way of perceiving the world. This message appears in the Upanishads. The soul remembers. It appears in Plato, learning is recollection. It appears in Kabbalah, the light was withdrawn so creation could unfold. It appears in Sufism, you were shown and then it was hidden. It appears in the Tao Te Ching. The ancient masters were subtle, mysterious, profound. Across cultures, mystics insist not on new revelation, but on remembering what was once known before birth. This remembering does not restore contact with the watchers, it restores the capacity they awakened, the ability to perceive patterns behind surface reality, the intuition that the world is layered, the awareness that consciousness extends beyond the boundaries of the individual self. Yet, as this inner awakening spreads, another phenomenon emerges, one rarely acknowledged in history: the rise of anomalous knowledge. Anomalous knowledge refers to insights achieved without apparent cause, leaps in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, or metaphysics that appear suddenly in individuals or small groups, independent of broader societal development. These anomalies do not suggest supernatural intervention. They reflect the watcher's imprint on the human mind, the capacity for sudden recollection. Consider how early Indian mathematicians conceptualized zero, a conceptual leap that should have taken centuries but appears fully formed. Or how the Greeks discovered irrational numbers, a revelation that disrupted their entire worldview. Or how Chinese astronomers identified celestial cycles with astonishing precision. Or how the Maya mapped Venus with accuracy rivaling modern measurements. These are not gradual accumulations, they are flashes, irregular, inexplicable, as though something dormant momentarily awakened. Some anthropologists describe these moments as cognitive expansions. Say, but they appear too patterned to be random. They cluster in moments when collective consciousness is strained or transformed, after crises, during migrations, in periods of deep introspection. Perhaps such moments thin the veil that separates ordinary consciousness from deeper memory. If so, then the watcher's withdrawal was not a simple exit. It was the beginning of a long oscillation, a rhythm in which humanity periodically reattunes to an older resonance, before drifting away again. This rhythm becomes visible again in the medieval period, though disguised beneath layers of dogma and institution. Hidden within monasteries, Sufi lodges, Taoist hermitages, and the esoteric schools of Europe, mystics continued the inward search. Despite the dominance of formal religion, there is evidence of a subterranean stream of knowledge, subtle, symbolic, often encoded in art, architecture, and ritual. Consider Gothic cathedrals, whose proportions reflect sacred geometry far older than medieval Europe. Consider the labyrinth at Chartres, reflecting ancient patterns of initiation. Consider Islamic geometric mosaics, which seem to map hidden mathematical symmetries. Consider Taoist alchemical texts describing the circulation of light within. Consider the Kabbalistic diagrams mapping the structure of existence. These expressions emerge centuries after the watchers have faded from myth, yet they retain the same underlying intuition, that the universe is structured, that humanity once knew this structure intimately, and that this knowledge can be approached through inner discipline, symbolic reasoning, and attunement to patterns. Even in the modern age, the watcher's echo continues to stir beneath the surface. The birth of modern science is often presented as a break from ancient superstition, but its earliest practitioners, Kepler, Newton, Copernicus, were deeply influenced by mystical ideas. Newton studied alchemy for decades, seeking the hidden principles underlying material reality. Kepler searched for harmonic ratios in planetary motion, believing the cosmos was constructed through musical proportion. Copernicus revived ideas from Hermetic texts that spoke of a sun-centered order. Why did modern science emerge not from purely rational inquiry, but from metaphysical longing? because the Watcher's imprint shaped the human drive to seek underlying order, even in a world where their presence had long faded. And yet, the modern age also marks a deepening of the separation between humanity and the unseen. Rationality expands, technology proliferates, materialism becomes dominant, external progress accelerates. But beneath this acceleration, something crucial begins to thin. The inner sensitivity that once aligned the mind with forgotten patterns. This thinning does not erase the Watcher's imprint, it distorts it. The desire for coherence becomes the desire for control. The search for meaning becomes the quest for utility. The inward gaze becomes the outward conquest of nature. It is in this context that the Watcher's echo begins to manifest in new, unexpected ways, not through myth or ritual, but through philosophical paradox, existential longing, and the quiet intuition that something essential is missing. Modern people describe this missing element not in religious terms, but in psychological ones, a feeling of disconnection, alienation, incompleteness. A sense of living in a world saturated with information yet devoid of orientation. A sense that the cosmos is vast but silent. This silence mirrors the Watcher's withdrawal, but deeper now, more total, because humanity has lost not only the presence, but the memory of presence. Yet even here, in the most disenchanted era, the Watcher's imprint stirs. It stirs in moments of sudden inspiration, artistic breakthroughs, scientific insights that arrive unbidden, dreams that reveal truths beyond conscious knowledge. It stirs in synchronicities, the strange sense that events align meaningfully. It stirs in the enduring global fascination with the origins of consciousness, the mysteries of ancient civilizations, the patterns hidden in myth. It stirs in the intuition, quiet but persistent, that humanity is not alone in a metaphysical sense, not watched literally, but witnessed by a deeper order. And it stirs in the recognition that every search for truth, scientific, philosophical, spiritual, is a continuation of a much older story. Because even now, long after the Watchers stepped beyond the visible world, humanity continues to behave as though responding to a distant signal. A signal not transmitted through words or appearances, but through the structure of reality itself, through the architecture of the mind, through the longing woven into human identity. This signal does not speak. It does not guide. It simply pulls, gently, persistently, towards something just beyond comprehension, a direction rather than a destination, a memory rather than an instruction, a feeling rather than a doctrine, as though the Watchers, in their final act, set something in motion that does not require their presence to unfold. And so humanity continues its long winding search, outward into galaxies, inward into consciousness, across the earth for traces of forgotten history. This search is not accidental. It is the echo of the oldest relationship humanity ever had, a relationship that shaped not only civilization but the very structure of the human mind. For even after their departure, the Watchers left behind something that no collapse, no dogma, no era of rationality could erase. The instinct to look beyond the visible world, an instinct that lingers, steady as a heartbeat in every generation. And though the Watchers no longer walk beside us, the question that shadows their absence remains. The same question that has shaped myth, science, ritual, philosophy, and longing since the earliest ages. What is it exactly that we are trying to remember? There is a peculiar quiet that settles over the final stretch of any long journey into the recesses of ancient memory. A quiet that feels less like an ending than like standing before an unseen horizon, sensing that the landscape continues far beyond what the eyes can perceive. In the story of the Watchers, this quiet emerges not as a resolution but as a realization that the mystery they embody was never meant to be solved in a linear sense. It was meant to be approached, circled, traced, contemplated. Each fragment of myth, each whisper in ritual, each astronomical alignment, each philosophical insight was a footprint on a path leading towards something that refuses to be captured directly. If the previous parts followed the arc of descent, rupture, withdrawal, and the long echo through human consciousness, this final stage turns toward the most subtle layer, the space where myth, history, and human destiny converge, not conclusively, but as parallel lines that stretch toward an unseen point. The Watchers, whatever they were, do not offer closure. They offer orientation. They leave behind a directional pull, a gravitational field of meaning that organizes the human search for coherence. This search intensifies precisely when worlds change, when civilizations collapse, when new knowledge emerges, when humanity confronts forces larger than itself. And in these moments of change, the Watcher's imprint resurfaces, not as a direct presence, but as a question. Where does knowledge come from? What guides the human instinct toward order? Why does the mind reach beyond what it can see? To understand this final layer, one must look not at the ancient past, but at the long arc of human thought, at the ways in which the Watchers' absence shaped the future more profoundly than their presence ever could. For their departure did not erase the memory of contact. It created the conditions under which humanity began exploring its own depths with unprecedented intensity. The most striking example of this long-term effect appears in the evolution of cosmology. In early societies, cosmology is not a theory. It is a lived experience. The sky's a map. The stars are signals. The cycles of the heavens structure time. After the Watchers withdraw, this cosmic intimacy fades from daily life, but it does not disappear. Instead, it becomes intellectualized, abstracted, mathematized. The movements of the heavens, once interpreted through myth, now generate astronomy. The symbols, once carved into stone, become equations. The patterns once felt intuitively become calculations. The transition from mythic cosmology to scientific cosmology is not a rupture. It is a continuation. The Watcher's legacy shifts from presence to intuition to formal inquiry. The earliest astronomer priests were not replacing myth. They were translating a memory that no longer spoke in the language of direct revelation. This translation appears again in metaphysics. Ancient metaphysical systems, Egyptian, Vedic, Greek, Persian, Chinese, describe the universe as layered, resonant, interconnected. After centuries of rationalization, this layered view reappears in modern physics as the study of fields, dimensions, and invisible forces shaping visible reality. Early myths speak of veils, thresholds, hidden realms. Modern science speaks of dark matter, quantum states, and non-locality. The language differs, but the orientation is the same. Reality is deeper than appearances. The Watchers did not teach scientific models, but they awakened a form of perception, an instinct for hidden order, that ultimately led humanity to search for patterns beneath chaos. Yet for all the brilliance of scientific inquiry, something remained missing: the human experience of meaning. As the world became more measurable, it also became more opaque. The precision of equations could not replace the sense of belonging to a vast intelligent cosmos. And so another form of inquiry emerged: existential philosophy. Here again, the Watcher's influence appears indirectly. For existential philosophy begins with the feeling of absence, the same absence that followed their withdrawal. Thinkers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, Camus grapple with a world that feels emptied of direct guidance. Their questions echo the oldest myths, though stripped of their symbolic language. What is the foundation of meaning? What is the nature of freedom? What remains when the gods fall silent? These questions are not modern. They are as old as the Watcher's departure. But in the modern age, they rise with new intensity, reflecting a world where rationality expands, but existential orientation thins. The Watcher's legacy becomes the human struggle to create coherence without external guidance. Yet the most profound continuation of their influence appears not in philosophy or science, but in the human yearning for transcendence, a yearning that persists across cultures, eras, and belief systems. This yearning does not diminish in the modern age. If anything, it intensifies. It appears in the global resurgence of meditation, in the search for altered states, in the fascination with near-death experiences, in the exploration of psychedelics not for escapism but for insight, in the growing awareness of consciousness as a frontier no less mysterious than the cosmos itself. This yearning reflects not a desire to return to the Watchers, but to rediscover the capacity their presence awakened. To stand once again in a world where meaning is not constructed but perceived. Yet the question remains, why did the Watchers withdraw? Myth Archaeology and psychology each offer partial answers, but none suffice on their own. Perhaps the withdrawal was not a punishment or a forced exile. Perhaps it was the closing of a cycle. Cycles are central to ancient cosmologies, yugas, suns, world ages, seasons of creation and dissolution. The Watchers appear in the mythic record at the dawn of one such cycle, and withdraw as the next begins. Their departure coincides with the rise of human self-direction, the moment when societies shift from external guidance to internal development. This shift is turbulent, but necessary. The Watchers teach the first principles. Humanity applies them. The Watchers withdraw. Humanity develops new capacities. The Watchers' echo remains, shaping the search for coherence. This pattern mirrors something universal in nature. Seeds sprout when the soil is ready. Wings open when the nest becomes too small. Consciousness expands when reliance gives way to exploration. The Watchers' departure, in this sense, may not have been abandonment, but trust, a recognition that humanity had reached a stage where direct presence was no longer needed, perhaps even limiting. Yet even as humanity moves forward, the Watchers' absence remains paradoxical. It feels both necessary and incomplete. The longing that follows their departure shapes religions, philosophies, sciences, not as attempts to return to them, but as attempts to understand the deeper architecture of reality that their presence once illuminated. This longing becomes most visible in the symbolic language of return. Across cultures, certain figures are expected to return at the end of cycles, or at the dawn of new ones. Quetzalcoatl, the white-bearded teacher of the Americas, the Egyptian Shemsu-Hor, whose reappearance signals a restoration of order, the Mahdi in Islamic tradition, the Kalki avatar in Hindu cosmology, the hidden sage in Taoism, the return of the Hopi Pahana, the reappearance of the sons of God in apocalyptic interpretations of the Enochian texts. These figures are not literal personalities. They are mythic expressions of a deeper pattern, the reopening of a boundary that once closed, a moment when the veil thins, a moment when cycles turn. If the Watchers' presence defined humanity's earliest age, and their absence defined the long arc of civilization, then perhaps their return is not an event but a shift, an increase in clarity, perception, coherence. Signs of such a shift appear quietly even now, not in spectacular visions or dramatic revelations, but in subtle convergences, the merging of scientific and mystical inquiries, the increasing recognition of consciousness as fundamental, the rediscovery of ancient symbolism through modern frameworks, the growing intuition that human identity extends beyond physical form, the global fascination with origins. These convergences do not imply a literal return. They imply that humanity is approaching a threshold, one similar to the one crossed when the Watchers withdrew, but in reverse. A threshold where the inner and outer worlds grow less divided, where perception broadens, where the longing that shaped millennia begins to resolve into a different orientation. Perhaps this is the Watchers' true legacy, not their presence or their absence, but the arc they set in motion. An arc that began with direct instruction, passed through long ages of forgetting, awakened through longing, matured through introspection, and now moves toward a new synthesis, one in which humanity seeks not the Watchers themselves, but the level of perception once shared with them. This does not mean humanity will regain what was lost in the same form. It means the structure of consciousness may expand, allowing a new relationship with the unseen, one shaped not by dependence, nor by rebellion, nor by nostalgia, but by maturity. For even now, in the quiet spaces of thought, in the questions that rise before sleep, in the strange certainty that something watches without intruding, without judging, without revealing itself, there remains a final whisper that the story is not closed, that the Watchers are neither gone nor returning, but present in a way the ancient world understood and the modern world is only beginning to rediscover. Present as orientation, present as longing, present as the architecture of meaning, present as the echo that draws the human mind toward mystery. And in this echo lies the final realization, not a conclusion, but an opening, that what humanity has been seeking all along may not be the Watchers themselves, but the part of itself that awakened in their presence, A part that waits quietly, just beyond the threshold, for the moment the veil becomes thin enough to see through once more.